So I spent last night working on this week's program. We've been developing this role-playing game, combat thing where a fighter fights with a wizard, and we set up the class structure, and the program didn't really do anything. So I sat down last night to start coding the actual functionality to make them fight, to make the fight happen, to roll to see if they hit each other, to roll the damage, all that stuff. And I got to the point where I created my objects, I created the fight method, I had the fight method have two characters that were passed to the method, roll for damage, had them hit each other, and then realized what I was doing wasn't working, and so I tried it a slightly different way. When I tried it a slightly different way, the way I thought would work better, I started getting an error. It was a null pointer exception error, meaning that you're trying to operate on some kind of object that isn't holding a value. And I knew this object was holding a value because I declared it in the constructor, and I was using it to do stuff in the constructor. I could print stuff out from it in the constructor. But when I tried to access it from outside the object, even from something which should have been able to access its variables, it was showing up as null. And I spent at least an hour debugging it, going in, putting different print statements in different places in the program to see where the variables were accessible and where they weren't, changing the variables themselves from private to public, which should make them accessible from anywhere. It still wasn't working. I was still getting errors, and I couldn't figure it out. And I spent about an hour on this, and the reason I'm recording this video, the first thing I want to say is it's not unusual. It's not unusual to at some point in a big project get an error that takes you an hour to figure out what the error is. It's happened to me a million times. It's something I'm familiar with. It's not something that's unprecedented in programming. It's typical, especially when you're still learning. And I'm also here to stress the value of that. There is something to be learned in the process of trying to figure out what the hell's going on with a program that's not working, and trying all the things you know how to do, because that's how you develop a personal process for, these are the kinds of mistakes I usually make, these are the things I should check first, this is how I check them. And I did all of those things, and it still wasn't working. And it got to the point where I needed to talk to somebody. I needed to talk to somebody who knew what they were doing. I could have pulled out my rubber duck or my space monkey and talked to them about it, but mostly I just talked out loud to myself, and I still couldn't figure it out. One of my kids is a math major with a computer science minor, and is a senior now and knows Java as well as I do. I texted them at 11:45 last night, and they didn't answer. So I did the next thing that occurred to me, which is I went to ChatGPT, or actually I went to Claude. Claude.ai is currently one of my favorite LLMs. And I said, if I give you some Java, can you help me figure out what the mistakes are? And it said, yeah, just paste it below. And I said, well, what if it's in multiple files? He said, well, just paste one class at a time. So I pasted in my main. It's like, okay, let me see your combat class. I pasted in the combat class. And without even exactly asking it to find a mistake, the AI is like, oh, you might be having a problem here where this variable that you declare in your combat class, you're redeclaring with a different name inside the constructor, and that makes it only a local variable to the constructor, not a global variable that belongs to the whole class. It makes it a copy, not its own. It's not referencing the original variable anymore. And it was just 2 words I had to take out of the code, and it took me well over an hour to figure it out. And the lesson I learned from that, or the thing I want you guys to take from that, as far as AI, and I've talked about AI in this course a lot, kind of when to use it and when not to use it. And I think that, even when you're still learning, is a good use case for AI. In other words, I didn't use AI until I was at the point where I've exhausted all my knowledge and I need to talk to another person. You would go to AI for a question like this at the same time you would come to my office and say, Dr. Morgan, I can't figure out what this problem is. Can you help me find the error? And a bunch of you have done that this semester. Even though it's an online course, a lot of you on campus, some of you drop by my office and ask me to help find errors, and I usually can, because a fresh set of eyes can usually spot those errors pretty easily. But thinking of the AI as that other person that you have as a resource. You guys have me. Who do I have? I've got my one kid. I don't think any of my colleagues know Java at RBC. Pody might know a little bit, but I think maybe from a long time ago. So who do I have to talk to about my Java problems? If it's midnight, well, Claude was there, and Claude did a kind of impressive job. I was like really impressed that not only did it find the error without quite being asked, but explained it in a really, really clear way. I was like, oh, sure, okay, now I see what the error is. I think that is an ethical way to use AI in education for you guys as students. I think it's an ethical way to use AI for me as a professional. If you did that in a project for the class, I would expect you in the comments around that place in the code where the error is to say, this code originally said this. It wasn't working. I couldn't figure out why. I asked ChatGPT, or I asked Claude, or I asked Microsoft Copilot to help me find the error. This is what the error was. This is why it was an error. In other words, explain the mistake you were making, and this is how I fixed it. Okay? I would have no problem with a student using AI in that way in a programming class. As a resource when you're stuck. As a way to evaluate a mistake that you have tried to find but can't. What I don't want to see is anytime you get a syntax error, oh, I got an error, let's throw that in ChatGPT and see what the error is, right? That's bad practice. You're never going to learn how to find your own errors in your code if every time you get a little syntax error, you throw it into ChatGPT. You wouldn't come to my office every time you get a syntax error. I hope every time you have a missing semicolon, you don't come knock on my door and say, hey, this is telling me it's an error. What is it? That process of finding your errors is what you're supposed to be learning in this class. So that was just a little thing I wanted to say this morning after kind of having the experience last night that you guys probably have all the time as students who are new to programming. When are you done? When do you run out of ideas? And making sure that that point is pretty far down the line. Finding a bug sometimes is 10 seconds if it's a semicolon, or you wrote equals when you meant to write equals equals. Those are easy to find. Just miscapitalizing a variable name, those are easier to find. These structural things in Java are harder to find. These things that are about the relationship of variables to methods. Now the other thing that happened is I got to this point in the code where the way I'm doing it is not going to work. And I know why it's not going to work. But I have to decide today, do I want to fix that? Because it looks like it works, but it's not going to work. Do I want to fix that? Or do I want to leave it in the looks like it works but doesn't work phase and have the homework for next week be, hey, this code looks like it works but it doesn't. Explain what about this code is not going to work based on the principles of object-oriented programming. I think I'm going to do that. Like, I'm going to fix it, but I'm not going to fix it until I ask you guys to explain to me what part of this way that I'm using the objects is going to run up against the kind of public-private who owns what limitations of Java. So that'll be a fun assignment. And don't just ask Claude why it's not going to work either, even though he can probably figure it out. All right, that's all I wanted to say this morning. I'll post this video and make it a little supplemental video for next week.